Oh.
She knows who I am. She doesn't need to hear it.
Sit down. Okay. Hi and good evening, everyone. My name is Sia Samanthan, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as the student director of Institute for Women's Leadership. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to our third and last segment of the 2019 Gender Summit, which was put together by so many amazing students and staff. Today, we're very honored to have Dr. Lair to be our keynote speakers. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude and appreciation to all the people who helped to make this happen, and to Liam, who took his time to meet with us today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elijah Henderson, and I am the student director of the Men's Development Institute. My pronouns are he, his, him. And tonight I have the honor of introducing Dr. Liam Lair onto the CSB SJU campus. Liam is a feminist scholar with a PhD in women, gender, and sexuality studies. His teaching and research are rooted in feminist studies with a specific focus in sexuality, trans subjectivities, disability, and race. His research and teaching focus on the intersections of gender, race, and ableism, and how we might begin to create a more livable future for our historically marginalized individuals and communities. He has worked with faculty, staff, and students to create a safe and affirming space for trans, gender nonconforming, and queer students at each of his previous institutions. And this is work he continues at his current position at Westchester University. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Liam Lair.
We waited for you, Quinn. We didn't start without you. Hi, y'all. Thank you, Elijah and Sam, so much for bringing me here. I am delighted to be back on campus at St. Ben's and St. John's. I was here as a faculty member, hey y'all, for 1 year. I'm like, I see people I know. I was here for 1 year, 3 years ago, as faculty in gender studies, and it was a really transformative moment in my life to be here and get to know students and get to know faculty and staff, and to see the work you all are doing here. And so it's really wonderful to be back. So thank you so much, both of you, for bringing me, for having me here this evening. So yeah, my name is Liam, he, him, and his, and like I said, I'm faculty right now at Westchester University, which is, it's only 25 miles outside of Philly, but it's like an hour away from Philadelphia because traffic and things. But that's where I am right now, so it's wonderful to be here from Philly, to be back in the Midwest. Hey, oh my God, all the people. Okay, so I have a little bit of time with you tonight, but I definitely want to leave time for Q&A. So I really appreciated when I started talking to Elijah and Sam about this year's Gender Summit, that it's not just a one day of events, that it's a series of events this week. So hopefully y'all have been to that, and you've been enriched and enlightened by some of the programming that they've done. But I really appreciate being here sort of at the end of all this to think about, when we think about gender, how can we complicate it? How can we queer gender? We're gonna talk about what that word queer means, what I mean when I say the word gender. We're going to do all of that. So I really appreciate being here. And part of tonight's talk is also going to be sort of a shout out. We're a day late, but for the Transgender Day of Remembrance. So we're going to sort of pay homage and name some of the folks that have been murdered at the intersection of gender-based violence, and often at the intersection of race and class and a lot of other ways that they exist in the world. So we're going to do a lot in the next 30 to 45 minutes, but again, we're going to have time for Q&A. So I guess I just also want to preface with, as I'm talking, if I say something that confuses you and you want me to stop and clarify, make some noise, raise a hand, do whatever you need to do to grab my attention, because I would like for this to be a conversation as much as a keynote can be a conversation. Also, in terms of accessibility, I have the mic, but please get up, move around, stand up, do whatever you need to do to make yourself comfortable. So, without further ado, this is the title of my talk, Gender Revolutionaries, Everybody Has a History. And anybody who's been to grad school, so the few faculty in the room know that it's really cool to put parentheses around parts of words, and it's kind of like a nerdy thing, so I had to do that. Anyway, what I want to talk about today and what I want us to think about this evening are three things. I want us to think about the relationship between our bodies and gender. right, to sort of tease out this relationship a little bit. I want us to think about how we can queer or challenge expectations around gender and sexuality, right? That we can talk about our bodies and gender and sexuality as separate things, but recognizing how they're all linked and inform one another. And then lastly, how each of us can be gender revolutionaries. I think we often think about trans people being the gender revolutionaries, but things aren't going to change if we all aren't on board. So that's what we're going to think about. And part of this is that we're going to learn about some revolutionaries that have come before us, that are contemporaneous, so that we're going to mix in some revolutionaries. So I've given some pieces of paper to folks in the audience, and so when the picture pops up of the person that you have, if you would stand up and share their bio with us, that would be awesome. So some audience participation so you don't have to just listen to me. So, for the win. So we're going to start actually with Sylvia Rivera.
Sylvia Rivera. Oh, thank you.
Sylvia Rivera was a Latina American woman who became one of the most radical gay and transgender activists of the 1960s and 70s. As co-founder of the Gay Liberation Front, Rivera was known for participating in the Stonewall riots of 1969 and establishing the political organization SDAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with fellow friends and trans activist Marsha P. Johnson.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. So we'll learn about Marsha P. Johnson as well, but yeah, she formed an organization called STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and sort of a caveat, that's not generally a word that we use anymore. It is seen as derogatory, but in her time, it was really political, and she was doing really cool things with it. So this is someone who you should know. All right, so starting with our bodies, sex and gender. So if I say the word sex, not the kind you have, but the kind you are, what comes to mind? What things make up sex? Reproductive system, okay. It's like internal anatomy. What else? Say it louder. Chromosomes. Louder. Hormones, like estrogen, testosterone, right? What else? Your body, right? If I held up a little tiny person and I said it's a boy, how do you know? Say it. Penis. Right? So genitals, gonads, right? There's a whole bunch of things that make up sex as we know it, right? So anatomy, gonads, genes, the brain. A lot of people think, how our brain shapes how we understand our bodies. Hormones, like we said, chromosomes. Well, what's interesting is that we're taught that there's just two, male and female. But that's not actually accurate, right? And so for those of you that are familiar with this, bear with me, jump in, add your own information, but I want to make sure we're all going to be on the same page, right? That we're taught that sex assigned at birth, there's only two, male and female. It's a lie. We've been sold a lie, right? There are tons of ways of being in the world outside of male and female. There's tons of intersex conditions, but there's even a great variation for folks who are assigned male or female at birth, right? That the little tiny person that I held up, that you would probably say, oh, it's a boy, might have XX chromosomes. XX is the one associated with female, right? I don't do science, I make my students science for me. But that little person might have XX chromosomes, right? I was assigned female at birth, and I might have XY chromosomes. I've never had my chromosomes checked. Most of you probably haven't either, right? So even before we get to gender and gender expression, there's a whole world of variation, right, of different intersex conditions. And so intersex is another way of talking about an umbrella term for people born with sex traits that don't fall neatly into either of society's categories for a male or female. And some folks think that this is actually quite rare, but it's not. How many of you know someone who has red hair? Right, so most everyone, right? So there's 1.7% of the population is intersex. And interestingly enough, global estimates that there are 2% of people in the world with red hair. So there are as many intersex people in the world almost as there are people with red hair. Now at some point in my 10 years of teaching, there was a group of students that heard me say everyone who's redhead is intersex. It's not what I'm saying, right? But chances are, if you raise your hand and you know someone with red hair, you know someone who's intersex. Now, do they know they're intersex? Maybe, maybe not, right? But again, before we even get to all the different ways we can identify with gender in the world, there's a ton of variation. And I also want to differentiate sex from gender, right? So sex is what we're assigned at birth, based mostly on our genitalia. Again, very rarely do people have their chromosomes checked. There's this weird way that hormones, right, get associated with particular bodies, even though we all have testosterone and estrogen in our bodies, right? That they aren't gender or sex-specific hormones. And so I want to challenge us to use the words female, male, and intersex for sex specifically. Right, those are scientific words. And when we talk about gender, to use words like woman, man, trans, and then I did ... because there's a whole bunch of genders, right? And the best way I've heard this explained, and some of you might have been in class earlier when I talked about this is my dog. I know, right? She's real cute, Maggie. That's Maggie. I don't live with Maggie. I miss her a lot right now. I joke with my partner that I miss my dog more than I miss her. It's not true, but she's real cute. So my dog Maggie is a female, right? And we do like an infantilizing thing with our pets, like, oh, she's a good girl, right? But it would be real weird if I got up here and talked about my dog as a woman, right? That'd be kind of weird. Like, oh, is your dog a man or a woman? Or is your cat a man or a woman? Like, it wouldn't make any sense, right? Because gender, and these words, woman, man, trans, gender fluid, non-binary, are particularly human things, right? It's something that we do. It's something that we act on every day, that changes over time, that's culturally specific, that's historically specific, right? What it means to be a woman, for example, today in St. Joe, Minnesota, is different than what it meant to be a woman 50 years ago in the cities, or 100 years ago in a different location completely, right? That these things change over time. There's nothing inherently essential about what it means to be a woman. So it's something that we learn. And then there's really specific expectations about the proper relationship between our bodies, sex, gender, how we identify, and then gender expression and how we act that out, right? There's a formula for it, as it were. So for example, if you're assigned female at birth, you're supposed to be a woman, and you're supposed to be feminine. If you're assigned male at birth, you're supposed to be a man, and you're supposed to be masculine. And if you break any one of these rules, it all starts to sort of fall apart, and people get really anxious about it, right? And again, these things are historically specific, geographically specific, culturally specific. So when we think about, for example, who has historically had access to womanhood, right? And how femininity has been defined, it's been aligned in very specific ways with whiteness, with heterosexuality, with a particular class status, right? So when we think about gender, we also can't think just about gender. We have to think about how it intersects with all the other ways we exist in the world. And the other piece about this is that, again, if this were a formula, if we have folks assigned male who are then men and masculine, and same with female, woman, and feminine, the result is always heterosexuality. And again, if we break the rules, or we mess up this formula somehow, particularly around masculinity, the rest of it falls apart, right? There's a way that masculinity has been defined as synonymous with heterosexuality, which makes masculinity super fragile, right? Which men are often trying to distance themselves from femininity, from queerness, from gayness, because it threatens who they are as men. Which, wouldn't it be awesome if we could redefine masculinity, which I know it's some of the work that MDI is doing, to make space for femininity, right? To access femininity in particular ways for men. All right, another gender revolutionary. Marsha P. Johnson. All right.
Marsha P. Johnson was an American gay liberation activist and self-identified drag queen. Known as an outspoken advocate for gay rights, Johnson was one of the prominent figures in the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. The P in Marsha P. Johnson stood for pay it no mind, and when people got too nosy about her, that is what she would tell them, pay it no mind. As New York prepared to mark the 50th anniversary of Stonewall alongside its Pride celebration, the city announced plans to build a statue honoring Johnson and her friend Sylvia Rivera.
Thanks. And part of the reason I'm including these gender revolutionaries is that I think sometimes folks get this idea that, oh, we're just now talking about gender and figuring things out and challenging gender. But there have been folks for generations challenging gender, right? Who have been gender revolutionaries, who have been really pulling apart the ways that we think that there are two, right? Really challenging this idea that there's only two genders. And she's one of them. She's a badass. I mean, pay no mind, like, it's amazing. All right, so thinking through gender and sexuality. There's rules of gender, right? So we've talked about sex and our bodies a little bit, but what are the rules of gender? Well, there's a couple, right? There are two and only two genders, man and woman, right? That's what it's supposed to be. We already know that's not real, right? That's false. Hard pass, right? Number two, genitals are the essential signs of gender, which some people believe, but again, I'm gonna say hard pass on that, right? I was assigned female at birth, but I don't feel like that prevents me from accessing masculinity or manhood. Same for trans feminine folks, right, who are assigned male at birth. They have as much access to womanhood as anyone else, regardless of what sex they were assigned at birth. That genitals, I think, are actually totally separate from gender, right? And we have this weird idea that like what color do you associate with boys? Blue. And what color do you associate with girls? Pink. And we talk about kids as like, well, they're naturally drawn to these colors, right? If like the desire for pink emanates from one's vagina, right? But what's fascinating is like, what's up? Hey, it's my friend. What's fascinating about that though, right, is that like 60 years ago, pink was a boy's color and girl was a blue's color. Blue was a girl's color and pink was a boy's color. Did I say that right? Right? So these things change over time, right? This stuff doesn't emanate from our biology, but we have this idea that it does, right? Boys are built different. No, we teach them to be different, right? So genitals are not the essential signs of gender. Everyone is one gender or the other, right? It's this weird thing where we have to pick, or we like push people into these roles. And again, if there are two and only two, and genitals are the essential signs of gender, we're really limiting what's possible, right? Like, I feel like, I don't know how many people are in this room, I'm bad at numbers, but I feel like there's an incredible diversity of like who you are in this space. And then we're only given two options is so absurd to me, right? Like, I'm not a big astrology person, but even that, there's 12 signs, right? Like, we should at least have 12 genders, if not more, right? Okay, so membership to one gender is natural. This is a weird thing we do also, where like, it's just the way it is, and we don't question it. And we're gonna talk a little bit about that in a second. This membership is permanent, this idea that we can't change, because any exceptions are not things we're gonna take seriously. It's only for entertainment, it's only something to be made fun of, right? So I call BS on all of these rules, but these are the rules we don't think about, that we live by, that we don't question, right? So I wanna ask you all, like, what are some institutions or places or things that make you choose one of just these two options, man or woman? St. Ben, St. John's. So colleges, institutions of higher learning, and especially a space like this where it's a gender segregated campus, right? You have to choose woman or man, right? There's not like a trans campus or non-binary campus. Yeah? Go for it. Bathrooms, oof, right? Locker rooms, bathrooms, all of those kinds of places. Bathrooms, again, we'll say it twice, yeah. Ooh, health insurance, medical care, right? Which is interesting because if you think about the way what insurance covers is so based on sexed bodies that, so I have a friend, and she's since passed away, but in Kansas she's trans feminine. And so she had all of her documents changed, so she was legally female. So then her insurance didn't cover her prostate exam, right? Like it was these weird gaps in how we split this stuff up. Like, why doesn't it just cover your body, right? But you have to choose these things, which then leaves out coverage on particular things, yeah? Driver's license? IDs, driver's license. I guess you don't probably have gender on your like student IDs, which actually makes sense because why do you need gender on your ID? No one needs gender on their ID. There's a picture, right? Like right now when I fly here, I have to choose a gender. What? Doesn't make any sense, right? So identification documents, right? Yeah?
In some state or country, marriage.
Marriage, right? Which we're also gonna talk about, right? So there's lots of places, schools, St. Ben, St. John's, gyms, locker rooms, bathrooms. And bathrooms, we can talk more about bathrooms in Q&A if you want to. I could do a whole talk just on bathrooms and how messed up they are. Not just around gender, around disability, around body size, around race, a whole bunch of stuff. Hospitals, health insurance, right? Shelters, which is something to think about too, right? Gender segregated spaces, if folks don't have access to stable housing, where do you go? If you're non-binary, if you're trans, if you're gender fluid. Prisons, right? Think about the violence that happens in prisons more broadly, is problematic. But when we think then too about how they're gender segregated and what that means for people's lives is really intense, right? And identification documents. So this is way that there's these rules and we sort of live by them, but they're also embedded in these institutions in ways that we don't often question. Right? You probably don't question when you have to like mark your gender, for most of us, when you go to the doctor, or when you have to mark your gender when you buy an airplane ticket. But if you think about how that makes folks feel that don't see themselves reflected in these spaces, or for whom that's dangerous, right? For traveling purposes, for some of these other spaces. What does that mean? How do we challenge these things? Another question I have for y'all. I want us to think about if gender is really natural, right? It's just how we are in the world. I want you to think about how you work hard at being your gender. So for example, name something that y'all do to maintain your gender, that the other gender, quote unquote, so we're talking in very binary terms here. What is something you do to maintain your gender that the other gender doesn't have to do?
Makeup.
Makeup. Do you know how much money feminine identified folks will spend on makeup over their lifetime? Any guesses? Oh, 8,000 is way too low. 15 to 300,000. Depending on, you know, like the folks that have like the 12 products at night and the 14 products in the morning and then their midday thing, like, I just started using face wash, y'all, because I got shamed by my friends. They're like, you cannot use Dove soap on your face. And I was like, all right. So I have like face soap now, right? But $15,000 to $300,000. Let's talk about gender equity. Something else you do. How many of you shave your legs? Why? Because you want to. Because your mom used to make you. Okay. Other reasons why. Why don't men shave their legs then? Like, is it awesome? Do you love shaving your legs? No. But you just said you wanted to. Yeah. So, okay. So you're not into it, but you want to. Real talk. Other folks, why do you shave your legs?
Because it's typically expected of females.
It's expected of females, it's expected of folks who identify as women. What are the consequences if you didn't shave your legs? Being shamed, you get called gross, you get called dirty, right? What are the consequences? Really nothing. It's way less time, right? I'm a dude now, y'all, and if masculine identified folks ever tell you it's more work to shave their face than their legs, they're lying. It is so much more work to shave your legs. You have to do it in the shower, you have like the thing, you gotta put your foot up and like don't fall, right? I like, every once in a while I'm like, I'm done, right? But it's fascinating that if it's natural to be this gender, why do we have to do all these things, right? Think about all the places that hair grows on all bodies. Armpits, faces, legs. Why is it that feminine identified folks have to do all of this maintenance? Right? It's a lot of work. And why? Really, why? I mean, yes, there are consequences if we break the rules, but if this is so natural, right? So it's interesting to think about this stuff, right? Implications for sexuality also, right? So we talked a little bit about sex. Signed female at birth, I was, right? Talked about gender. I'm masculine, let's say for all intents and purposes, I'm a man, right? And I sort of perform masculinity in particular ways. I'm not particularly gender non-conforming, right? But what's interesting is when we start to think then about sexuality and what the implications for sexuality are. Because most often when we define sexuality, we aren't separating sex and gender, right? So for instance, a question for y'all. If that's me, when I had hair. I had such good hair, y'all. If I were to fall in love and marry Tom Cruise, right? Say this was a decade ago. Let's say this was today. We could get married, and the US would consider that a heterosexual union. So am I gay or am I straight if I marry Tom Cruise? Right? I feel like it would be like super gay in like the most fabulous way. But what's fascinating, right, is that this would be considered a heterosexual union by the US government. This could have happened well before marriage equality passed, right? So again, when we pull sex and gender apart, when those become two distinct things, when sex has nothing to do with my gender, the way we talk about sexuality stops working. So actually, in terms of sexuality, I identify as queer, right? I don't identify as straight. I don't want to be straight. There's nothing wrong with being straight. I just don't want to be straight, right? That's not how I identify. So queer works for me, right? And so that's one use of queer that we can think about is how do we queer sexuality? How do we think about how different bodies come together, right? For example, when you are looking to date someone, what attracts you to them? What's something you find attractive in a potential partner, if you desire to be with someone? Not everyone does. Physical appearance, like specifically, like
Hair.
hair.
Yeah.
Personality, right? You don't want to date someone who's like super boring. What else? Intelligence. Humor. I want to date someone who's funny. My partner's super funny. Most people like her more than they like me. What else? Anything else? That's it? What's up? They're caring or nice, right? And we could go on, right? And what's fascinating about this question is that I have asked probably over 1,000 people this question. Not once has someone said, I really like penises. I'm attracted to penis. Like, you aren't attracted to people's genitals, right? I'm not saying you don't have preferences, but if you really think about what you're attracted to in a person, you're not attracted to their junk. You're attracted to who they are. You might be attracted to masculinity, you might be attracted to femininity, but if we can separate what we're attracted to and who we're attracted to from this essentializing notion of gender, of sex, right? How much more freeing and fun that would be, right? You aren't worried about the way bodies come together. You're just like, I just met a nice person who is fun and funny and they're hot as hell and I don't care what's in their pants. Like, how amazing would that be, right? So that's one of the ways we can think about queering gender. And get away from this idea that we're so committed to two sexes, right? Anne Fausto Sterling is a really cool scholar that y'all can read that talks. She's actually a feminist biologist. She's a scientist, so she sciences for me, because again, I don't science. But she says that the Western culture is deeply committed to the idea that there are only two sexes, but also two genders, and that we define sexuality through the way we ignore the difference between the two, as well as the variation among them, right? So really pulling these things apart is important. So I want to talk about next how we queer this sex-gender system. Okay. One more bio. We got Rupaul. Yes.
Okay, Rupaul Andre Charles is an American drag queen, actor, model, singer, songwriter, and television personality. Since 2009, he has produced and hosted the reality competition series RuPaul's Drag Race, for which he has received 4 Primetime Emmy Awards in 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. RuPaul is considered to be one of the most commercially successful drag queens in the United States, and in 2017, he was included in the annual Time 100 list of the most influential people in the world.
Thanks. Anybody here watch RuPaul's Drag Race? Yes. Everybody needs a little bit more drag in their life. If you haven't been to a drag show, go to a drag show. It's life-changing. Okay, so queering the sex, gender, and sexuality system. What does this word queer mean to y'all? Is this a complicated word? What are associations y'all have with this word? Political, umbrella term, sexuality, identity, non-conforming, expression. So we have some different associations with this word, right? Technically it means odd or strange. A lot of folks use it as an umbrella term for LGBT. I use it sometimes because I don't want to say all the letters. But some people use it as an umbrella term. Some folks have reclaimed this word, right? Historically, it has been used in really violent ways against LGBT folks, but folks have reclaimed it as a term of empowerment, right? And that's one thing I think across the board, any term that has been used against a historically marginalized community, they have the right to reclaim it. Now, folks outside that community, not as much, right? But queer is a little bit different, right? So some folks do have access to this word that aren't a part of the community. It's also a form of rebellion. And I think what I find really empowering about this word is that it challenges naturalness, right? That challenges the naturalness of categories like sex, gender, and sexuality. That we are born a particular way, that we have to adhere to a particular set of standards. That queer sort of calls BS on normal, right? It wants us to challenge what normal is for us and for other folks. And in that way, it can be really freeing. All right, one more. Alok. Oh, grab the mic.
Thank you. So, Alok Ved Menon is an American performance artist, poet, and LGBTQ rights activist based in New York, New York. They identify as gender non-conforming and trans-feminine and uses singular they pronouns. Their eclectic style and poetic challenge to the gender binary have been internationally renowned. In 2017, they received the Live Works Performance Act Award, granted to 10 performance artists across the world, and released their inaugural poetry chapbook, Femme in Public.
Brilliant. Alok is amazing. You should follow them on Instagram. But they have this thing that's so interesting. They're a poet, and one of their poems, they talk about how they experience street harassment a lot, just walking around New York City. And they talk about how they got their body for free and they got their dress for $1, but you've been making them pay for it every day since, right? So to think about, I'm offering you ways to queer gender and to queer sexuality, but I want to acknowledge that there are very real consequences for this, more so for particular bodies than others, but I don't take this stuff lightly. But they're super incredible. So I want to talk a little bit about heteronormativity, right? Heteronormativity. If we're going to challenge and queer the sex, gender, sexuality system, we have to be able to name and identify the way these systems control us and have power over us, right? So heteronormativity, the fancy word, sort of explanation for this, is the institutions, ideologies, and systems that make heterosexuality the presumed sexuality, where it is privileged above other sexualities, right? So one of the questions I asked earlier on campus in one of the classes I was in, if I walked out on campus right now and I found like the tallest, biggest dude on campus, and I asked him if he had a boyfriend, how do you think most folks would respond?
Hell no.
Maybe not with kind words, right? Unless that person was actually queer identified, they might take offense, right? That we presume heterosexuality, that if I came in here and I asked you all, hey, are you down in supporting gay folks? Most folks would probably nod their heads, maybe raise their hand, yeah, I'm down. Then if I said, well, I'm gonna assume everyone here is gay. I'm gonna assume every single person in here is trans. If that makes you uncomfortable, I want you to question why. If you're down for the cause, what makes you so uncomfortable with being identified with that community, right? Because heterosexuality is the presumed sexuality. We don't generally ask other folks we identify as men, do you have a boyfriend? We ask them, do you have a girlfriend? And then we have to be corrected, right? There's a reason that straight folks don't have to come out. So how is this sort of operationalized in our everyday life where we presume heterosexuality, where we presume folks are not trans, right? And we're rewarded by being heterosexual by mainstream institutions in lots of different ways. Language, right? I have a really hard time, my aunt, who is 74, she lives with her partner, they've been together for 20 years, but they aren't married. But it's so weird because I can't call her like his girlfriend, right? He's not her boyfriend, like it's infantilizing, because what's supposed to happen? You're supposed to get married. They're supposed to be husband and wife, that we don't even have language to talk about people other than what we've appropriated from the queer community, partner, right? So we're privileged in language, wedding items, marriage, generally, right? How many of you who identify in this room as straight plan to take your husband's last name? Nothing wrong with that. Why do you want to do that? There are really good reasons to do this. For folks that do, why do you want to take his last name? Anyone willing to share? Convenience. I mean, one name is way easier than two. I support that. Other folks?
Culturally determinate.
Culture, so it's just sort of the norms, the traditions, right? A lot of folks have talked about, well, if we want to have kids, we want our kids to have the same last name, which I think makes a ton of sense, right? Family cohesion. Absolutely. I think there are really good reasons to take someone's last name. But my question for folks is always, well, if those are the reasons, right? Cohesion, one unit, it's convenient, why doesn't he take your last name? Right? Just throwing it out there, right? Because there's these traditions that we just don't question, right? If you want your dad to walk you down the aisle, why not your mom? Why not both of them? Why does he get to wait up front? I don't want to have to walk, right? I mean, granted, I'm a dude, so I would be up in the front, I guess, if I like had a heteronormative wedding. But like, why don't you both get walked down the aisle, right? Like, queer this stuff. Think about why you're doing it. Don't just go along with it. Expectations of children, right? Are there any folks in here who don't want to have kids? What happens when you tell your family that? One exception. Are you cool with it?
Yeah, I get told a lot, especially like in context of my transition. When I started medically transitioning, a lot of people who helped me along with that were saying, "Well, are you sure you don't want to have kids in the future?" And I have to consistently
So people don't believe you, they don't take you seriously when you know you don't want to have kids, right? I haven't wanted kids ever, right? They're amazing, I'm glad all of you were born, but like, I don't want kids. Hard pass, right? Other folks, right? There's this expectation that particularly for folks assigned female at birth who are racist women, that it is your maternal duty. It's how we define value for women, right? That you're supposed to have kids. To the point where if you want to, for example, have a hysterectomy, right? That doctors will deny you that because just in case you change your mind, right? You literally don't have autonomy over your bodies because you might want to have kids someday. What? Doesn't make sense, right? So we don't even question these norms of heterosexuality. Taking people's last names, the way we do weddings, why we wear white, right? Why do women wear white? Some queen did it like 500 years ago, right? What's up?
It's a symbol, it was like traditionally a symbol of purity, like on your wedding day.
Oof.
Right.
Right. He doesn't have to wear white, does he? Funny. Right, who wears an engagement ring? What? Why doesn't he wear a ring? Just wondering. I mean, they're cute. Everyone should get a ring. Just saying. All right. And so homonormativity is this other thing that's happened, right? So I don't want to essentialize folks that are straight as being like not subversive, because there are ways that LGBT people can buy into these same narratives. And homonormativity is the way of talking about that. It's the privileging of heteronormative ideals and constructs onto LGBT culture and identity, right? So the idea of monogamy, the idea of the gender binary, assuming people aren't trans, that there's a lot of folks who think that this should be replicated in LGBT cultures and communities, right? And it perpetuates these same inside-outside sort of narratives that there are bad queers and there are good gays, right? And so really challenging, no matter what your sexuality is, no matter what your gender is, no matter how you exist in the world, how do we think about how these expectations rule our lives? And so some queer critiques, some ways that this plays out in the queer community at least, and that this is really broadly defined, right? I think there are some straight folks who might identify with the queer community in this, of marriage, of gender, and sexuality. So for example, marriage, right? What are some of the rights you get when you get married? Like you get like 1,000 and some rights when you get married officially with the government. Tax breaks, healthcare,
access to individual when they're in hospice.
Right? Access to individuals if they're in the hospital, you need to make decisions for them, which is, you know, convenient. But the queer critique of marriage is like, why are all these rights wrapped up in marriage anyway? Why can't we get healthcare outside of our jobs and outside of monogamous heterosexual marriages or homosexual marriages? Why can't we have access to making decisions for the ones we care about outside of marriage? Why can't we get tax breaks outside of marriage, right? A queer critique of marriage wants to pull those things apart. Queer critiques of gender, right? If you Google gay men, this is what you get. What do y'all notice? I don't look like that, I mean, Jesus. Right, mostly white, mostly like outrageously physically fit. I mean, there's gotta be some Photoshop. Like, do people actually look like that? Maybe. I don't know, somebody does, right? But like how normative this is, right? Why are there not more representations of different kinds of bodies when you Google these things, right? Why are they mostly white, light-skinned, no one with disabilities, no one with fat bodies? Like it's really intense how normative these images are. And sexuality, right? There's a piece from Gail Rubin that you can read that's really interesting, and she has this picture, it's called the charmed circle. So you probably can't read this, I'll read it to you. But there's this inner circle that she calls the charm circle around sexuality. And then the outside circle are this sort of bad, abnormal ways of being in the world, right? So the charm circle involves folks that are heterosexual, married, monogamous, procreative, non-commercial sex, sex only in pairs, only in a relationship, same generation, in private, without pornography, only bodies, and like vanilla, like missionary, right? So these are the kinds of sex acts that are blessed by our culture. And everything else is outside of that. It's seen as bad, abnormal, deviant, right? Unmarried sex, promiscuous sex, commercial sex, alone or in groups, so this includes masturbation, right? In public, lots of ways that sex, we have demonized these particular acts, right? And so again, the way we can queer this is to think about how it doesn't matter what your identity is, how do we expand ways people can think of and access sexuality in ways, as long as things are consensual and things are healthy, how can we expand what counts as healthy sexuality? And that's a queer take on sexuality, right? Again, challenging these normative ways of being. All right, Tourmaline. Yeah.
Tourmaline is an activist, filmmaker, and writer based in New York City, currently through 2016 and 2018, activist in residence at Barnard Center for Research on Women. She's a transgender woman who identifies as queer. Tourmaline is most notable for her work in transgender activism and economic justice, through her work with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Critical Resistance, and Queer for Economic Justice.
All right. Okay, so a few more things and then we'll wrap up in like the next 5 minutes. So I want you to think about how it's your turn, right? How can you break the rules? How can you be a gender revolutionary? Because again, if all of us aren't on board with doing this work, folks are suffering in really intense ways. We all need to do this work, right? So one, recognizing that there are more than two genders. Super simple, right? You don't have to like identify outside of the two genders if you don't want to, but just recognizing that more than two genders exist is profound for people's lives. Disconnecting sex from gender, super important, right? That expands how we think about ourselves, how we think about sexuality, how we body forth in the world. And again, acknowledging that not everyone is a man or a woman, that the possibilities for gender are endless. Gender is a blast. It's super fun. Why not have fun with it, right? Whatever that looks like for you. And opening up possibilities for sexuality in ways that are not reliant upon normative gender expectations or normative expectations of sexuality. Again, thinking about when I asked you all, what are you attracted to? No one talked about genitals, right? So really being open with who you find yourself in conversation with and what that might look like. Some specific things for schools, right? Have gender inclusive bathrooms and changing facilities. That's really important, again, for safety. Zero tolerance policy on gender-based discrimination. How are those instituted at the policy level, at school, wherever you might work in the future? Sexual and gender diversity in curricula and class options. For community leaders, when you do community work on campus, when you do community work outside of these spaces, lead by example, right? Who's represented in terms of the leaders in those organizations? Are they diverse in terms of sexuality and gender? You don't have to be the expert, right? Start where you're at, start the conversation, and bring other folks in who have expertise, and take responsibility for your own education. And when you all, if you become parents, this is crucial, right? Provide images and stories that include sexual and gender diversity, listen to your child's self-affirmed gender identity, allow for questions and exploration, and remember that your child's most important ally. And I have at the very back a gender inclusivity quiz that asks some questions of you, as well as any institutions you might work with, and you can grab those on the way out, as a really concrete way of thinking how you're doing this work and ways to do this work better. Kate Bornstein.
Since 1989, trans trailblazer Kate Bornstein has, with humor and spunk, ushered us into a world of limitless possibility through re-envisioning the gender system as we know it. Kate identifies as non-binary, not a man and not a woman, and she's been writing about non-binary gender identity for nearly 30 years. The titles of her books say a lot about who she is and how she views things. Gender Outlaw on Men, Women, and the Rest of Us, My New Gender Workbook, a step-by-step guide to achieving world peace through gender anarchy and sex positivity, and A Queer and Pleasant Danger.
Her stuff is really amazing, y'all. Okay, I have just a few more things, and we'll wrap up. If you think about all the gender revolutionaries we just learned about, you might have noticed that most of them, all of them were trans feminine in some capacity, and most of them were trans women of color, right? And that's intentional because if we think about who has done the most work in these communities, a lot of time that work falls to women of color, right? That the sort of transcestors or trans revolutionaries that have come before us, that are active today, that are the most vocal, are folks you may never have heard of, but they've done incredible work. And so I also want you to think about, if you haven't heard of these folks, why not? Why didn't you learn about these folks in history class, right? Miss Major is another incredible trans revolutionary. There's this short video that I can play afterwards if you all want to hear it, but to save time, I'm going to skip it. But she talks about trans visibility, right? That she is visible enough, that particularly Black trans women are visible enough because those are the folks that are experiencing violence and harassment. And what we need more visibility from are the folks who are allies to the community, right? Are you visible in saying that you love and appreciate trans women and trans men and non-binary folks? Are you active in naming that in your communities? Are you active in calling things out when people say transphobic jokes or mean things or dismiss trans people altogether? So how are you visible in those ways? And so I want to end with an acknowledgement of Trans Day of Remembrance, right? And so this is a chart, and I'll read a few things from this, that between the 1st of January 2008 and 30th September of 2019, over 3,000 murders of trans and gender diverse people were registered worldwide. 250 of those were in the US. 26 of them were this year. And again, mostly trans women of color, right? And what's devastating about some of these murders is that they are particularly brutal, right? Because of the way we respond to femininity and trans femininity in particular, particularly on brown and Black bodies, right? And Gwendolyn Ann Smith is the woman who started Trans Day of Remembrance in 1999 as a vigil to honor the memory of Rita Hester, a trans woman who was killed in 1998. And so we've celebrated Trans Day of Remembrance every single year since then to commemorate all the folks that have been murdered. And Bryn Bogart says this, and we're gonna read some of the names together right when we wrap up. So let's take a moment to read those lists and let those names trickle over to our tongues. Let's go out and yell them so that everyone hears and no one cannot listen. So no one can reduce those names to statistics or gruesome reenactments. I want a future where we will not have to list any more names. Those lists are the foundation we will build our future on. They are the litany of our lovers. They are the names of our saints. So I would invite you all, if you're willing, to say these names with me. And again, to think about why we don't know these names. Johanna Medina Leon, Jazeline Ware, China Lindsay, B. Love Slater, Regina Brown, Tamika Washington, Denali Berry Stuckey, Cecilia Cranko, Ellie Marie Washta, Claire Legato, Paris Cameron. And those are only a few of the names, right? And so, as an ending, I also want to remind us that this is a really devastating reality for many trans women, right? But what I also appreciate is that a lot of trans folks have started a simultaneous celebration called Trans Day of Resilience. Because to be trans, for many of us, is freedom, it's an adventure, it's endless. I would choose this any day of the week, right? And I continue to choose my transness. And it's something I celebrate, and it's something I love. But I also want you all to choose whatever gender is affirming to you, but do it in the best way possible. Break the rules, right? Notice the things that are holding you back. Whether it's shaving your legs, whether it's not being able to cry, whether it's whatever it is, right? We have to be gender revolutionaries in our own right. And when I was here in April, I ended my talk with a quote from Mother Jones, I'm gonna end it today, that we need to pray for the living, or pray for the dead, right? But we need to fight like hell for the living. So that's what I got for y'all tonight. Thanks, y'all. Cool. So I think we have time for Q&A.
We do. We have this room until like 8:30.
Oh, I should just keep talking now. Sorry.
If
Yeah,
you guys
curious.
want to just stay for Q&A section, feel free to do so. If you guys have some other events.
Yeah, I know there's some other stuff happening. There's other stuff happening. I don't know what it is, but I understand folks have to go. So if you need to leave, I totally get it. I will not be offended. I appreciate you being here. But if you have questions for me or things you want to add, things you want to share, like, let's chat. I got a car tonight, so I don't have anywhere to be. Drive myself home. Yeah. What conversation? Okay, yeah. So the question is, thanks y'all, have a good night, be safe. Stay warm. So how do you bring up these conversations with folks about gender, sexuality, things like this, right? Well, I mean, I think there's a ton of ways to do that. I mean, we're talking about sex and sexuality all the time anyway, right? So several things, right? Like I think if you are watching TV shows or consuming media that is really inclusive, so those things sort of naturally come up, right? But it can be questions. It can be if someone asks you or talks about who they're dating, like why not say, well, have you ever been open to other ways of being in the world, right? Or how do you experience your gender? Like I think I come and I talk about being trans, and there's this expectation that I like share my coming out story, and like, when did you know you were gay, and when did you know you were trans? And I don't mind doing that, right? I've honed that over many times of telling, right? I've probably told my coming out story hundreds of times, right? But we don't ever ask folks who are cis, right? So trans is a way to talk about folks whose gender identity doesn't align in a normative way with the sex they were assigned at birth. So I'm trans, I was assigned female at birth, I identify as masculine. Cis is a way to talk about folks whose gender identity aligns in a normative way with the sex they were assigned at birth. So my partner was assigned female at birth, she identifies as a woman, so she's cis. So we don't ask cis people, well, when did you know you were a woman? When did you know you were a man? And why not? Right? Like I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, how did you know when you were whatever gender you are, right? How did you know that whatever sexuality you have was your sexuality? Have you ever stopped to consider it? Like, I think even having those kinds of conversations with your friends can be really interesting. Unfortunately, most often these conversations come up because somebody said something problematic. And someone asked me today in a class, he was like, I don't always know what to say. I feel like I'm gonna say the wrong thing, and so I think that's what keeps folks from intervening. And I was like, you're right, I can see where that would be a huge barrier, but if you don't start the conversation, who is? Right? You don't have to be an expert to know something's wrong, right? Like as a white person, if somebody says something really racist, even if I don't have a response in that moment, I can still say, I don't know what to say, but that was wrong and inappropriate, right? I've stopped it. And then if I can figure out what to say, I will say something more, right? But there's a way that silence is complicity, so how are we engaging in these conversations? And I think part of that work too is trying again to recognize the way we operate with particular assumptions, assuming everyone's straight, assuming everyone is cis, and by stepping back and thinking about that, we'll open up a whole host of conversations. And that's something you can share with your friends, you can talk about with your friends, like, yeah, I've been working on this and it's been really interesting, that I don't assume these things, what does that look like? Working on using inclusive pronouns, right? Only using they, them, unless you know pronouns otherwise, can really change the way you look at things. But you can even start small, like gendered expectations for feminine folks, right? And I've talked about this a few times today. How many of you who identify as women, when you're walking on campus and a guy is walking towards you, you move out of the way? If you are a woman on campus, St. Ben St. John's, and a guy is walking towards you, you move out of their way.
And say, oops, I'm sorry.
Or if they knock into you, you say, oh, I'm sorry, even though they bumped into you. Stop. Don't do that. Right? So even questioning the way that we have learned gender in really particular ways, in really binary ways, that I want us to challenge, that can be incredible, that can be so freeing not to say I'm sorry anymore. Don't say I'm sorry. Unless you actually like hurt someone. Then maybe. Yeah, does that help? Do y'all have ideas for how you can start these conversations? How have y'all started these conversations with folks?
I guess more specifically, it's like with my mom.
Parents.
And we just have fights all the time. And she'll say things like to my brother, like, hey, you're not allowed to have earrings because I don't want you to be gay. And then we just have this huge fight crying over it.
Yeah, earrings have been known to make people gay. That's how I got gay. Ooh, and that's, I mean, sometimes, right, it's chipping away a little bit at a time. But with stuff like that, I would be so fascinated to ask her, like what about earrings makes people gay? Like, and have her answer that. Be like, does it, like, he puts them on like penises? Like, what? Like, I'm so confused by that. So, like, having her explain the absurdity of statements like that, right? Like, my mom, when I stopped shaving my legs, she's like, that's disgusting. And I was like, what? Dudes have leg hair? She's like, I know, but it's different. I'm like, but my legs are legs. She's like, well, it just, and like she kind of got like kerfuffled and didn't know what to say. Because I pushed her, I was like, no, say what you mean. And when you really push people to say what they mean, a lot of times they realize how absurd it is, right? And so if she's anti-gay, just say it, right? But don't like blame it on the earrings. Besides, earrings are cute. I like my earrings. I don't know. So yeah, parents are hard, chipping away. The last thing I'll add is I think maybe engaging in conversation when it's not in the moment, right? When emotions aren't high, be like, hey, I noticed you said this, and I'm really curious, like, why, what if he was gay? Or what is it about earrings again? Like, I'm actually really curious about this now. Like, I want you to like check back in with me, like, what is it about the earrings? But I think we often want to engage in the moment, which is really important to disrupt whatever's happening, but re-engaging, especially with folks we're in a relationship with, when it's not in the heat of the moment. To say, this really bummed me out, because I have friends that are gay, or, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Like, let's talk about this. Other question? Yeah?
Do you have any thoughts about Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign as sort of rhetoric that implies that he's representative of the entire LGBT community?
So Mayor Pete, do I have any ideas about Mayor Pete and that he's representative of the entire gay community? I mean, the same, Caitlyn Jenner, right? All trans people, and I do not, I'm not her biggest fan. So have you all ever seen Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, A Single Story? Yeah, so I would recommend it. And there's this way that, I mean, because I would imagine most of the folks saying that are like straight folks who aren't queer, who aren't in the community, right? And when you have historically marginalized groups, right, one person becomes the representative because there's no nuance, right? It's the same way, and I know it happens on this campus. I was talking to students earlier, right, where faculty or folks start talking about folks of color, and then the one student of color in the space are like, well, can you tell us about what it means to be brown, right? Or the one queer person in the room, like, what does it mean to be gay, right? And you're supposed to talk for the entire community as if there were no nuance and there was no specificity or variation in the way folks thought, right? So I think that's part of what's happening, is that despite the many, hopefully, queer folks, LGBT folks you all know, there's still a way that white supremacy and whiteness gets read onto gayness, at least the mainstream level, right? That the face of the mainstream gay movement is very white, it is very wealthy, it's very masculine. And that's where I think fights for example, marriage equality have come from. Again, there's nothing wrong with marriage equality at its core, I guess, like it's helped people out. But it's really interesting to me that it's these very wealthy white gay men who are like, well, we're just like you, except for this one thing, right? Well, who does that leave out? Everyone else, literally, right? How does that help poor folks? How does that help, you know, folks who, if they got married, they wouldn't be able to qualify for assistance from the government anymore? Like, who does that not serve? Yeah, so for, if you get married, right, you get certain tax breaks if you're wealthy. But for poor folks, if you get married and there's two adults living in the same home, when you get married, all of a sudden your income is just high enough where you don't qualify for assistance anymore, but the money you're making still isn't enough to live on. So it actually disqualifies you from particular social programs, right? And again, the way that rights are wrapped up in that. So I guess for Mayor Pete, it's not surprising. I actually hadn't heard that. I'm not his biggest fan generally, for what it's worth. So I haven't been following him particularly closely. But I guess I'm not surprised, again, in the way that Ellen, right, has become a stand-in for all lesbian women, all queer women. My friend Mandy, who does not look anything like Ellen, but wears glasses, always gets, oh, you look just like Ellen, right? And it's that sort of like homophobic thing where like people of color get confused because they all look the same, right? Like it's this like lack of legibility that manifests in really homophobic and racist ways. So I feel like it's just an extension of that. So like that sort of answers the question. Yeah. Mayor Pete. Yes?
So how do you feel about bathrooms?
How do I feel about bathrooms? They're the worst, y'all. I mean, say more specifically, what do you mean how I feel about them? You just want me to talk about them?
Like, talk about what you talked about in our class yesterday, because I thought that was great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So bathrooms, you can tell a lot about an institution based on their bathrooms. Who's welcome, which bodies are welcome. It tells us who we're supposed to be in the world, what gender we're supposed to be, what our body size is, right? And this has been a really consistent theme historically with bathrooms, right? So if we even think back to who's supposed to be in public space. When bathrooms, public restrooms were first invented, they were called comfort rooms, and they were meant only for men. Who's supposed to be in public? Men, right? During Jim Crow South segregation, right? And I'm going to preface this with, right, we don't use words with ED at the end, we use people of color, right? People with disabilities. But during Jim Crow in the South, right, there was a bathroom that said colored, and there was a bathroom that says ladies. What does that say about who gets to be a lady? White people, white women get to be ladies, right? So it's defining who gets access to this. If we think now, right, who gets to access bathrooms? When you go into a stall, you know, and you're wearing your backpack and you like get into the stall and you like step over the toilet, and then you can kind of close the door and there's like nothing, right? Whose body is that accommodating, right? I'm a pretty small dude, and if it's barely accommodating me, right, what is my body supposed to be like? If I'm a chair user and I can't get into the bathroom, much less is there a stall that accommodates me, what does that say about who's allowed to be in these spaces, right? If you're menstruating, if there's no products for you, if you're a parent and there's no changing table, right? Bathrooms tell you so much about who's at the table, about who's creating these spaces, because how many of you, hopefully everyone has peed at least once today, right? If not, please hydrate, drink more water, right? But you've all probably used a public bathroom today. So what does it mean for folks that are literally like existing at these intersections of identity who can't use these spaces or who don't feel safe using these spaces, right? It's something we all need, right? How many of y'all who identify as feminine in this space have waited in line, right? Where there's no line for the men's and there's a line for the women's, right? What is that? Or Starbucks, where there's 2 single-use bathrooms and they're gendered. It's a toilet and a sink, right? It's not a penis and a vagina room, it's a toilet and a sink. But I've had people refuse to give me the key to the other bathroom. Because I don't know, like I'm gonna go in there and like grow the other set of genitals. Like it's so absurd to me, right? Bathrooms are fascinating. And again, where are folks supposed to be? What year did women in the Senate get their own bathroom? 1993. What year did women in the House get their first bathroom? 2011, right? And previous to that, women who were in Congress had to use the tourist bathroom. And if they had to go during a vote, they'd miss the vote. Who's supposed to be in these spaces? Who are these institutions built for? Not us, most of the folks in this room, right? So bathrooms are fascinating. There's whole books written on them, y'all. So that's bad bathrooms. Yeah, what's up?
I don't know if you yourself consider yourself to be spiritual, but how can those who are better accommodate LGBTQ+ communities?
Brilliant. So folks who are spiritual or religious accommodating LGBTQ communities. Talk to Anna Mercedes. There's wonderful feminist, queer theological interpretations, particularly of Christian theology, but I think any faith, any religion, there are extremes on all the sides, right? There's middle of the road folks, and there are always going to be communities that are really accepting and affirming. I can speak, when I first came out as gay, I identified as Christian at the time, and it was really important for me to be able to reconcile being gay with being Christian. And I was able to do that because there's such wonderful scholarship and literature out there. But I was also told, it was really interesting, I met with this gentleman, he was a pastor, I guess, and I was like, I need to figure this out. And he's like, I can get you books and I can connect you with folks, but you also have to know that there are folks you will never convince, and that has to be okay. And that it's really up to you reconciling this, no matter what you can read, like you have to be okay with God in your own right. And again, whatever God means to y'all, right? Regardless of scripture. That if you know that you are seen and that you are happy and that you are fulfilled by who you are in the world, that you have to be okay with that. So I think it's important to study the theological aspects of stuff. Justin Tanis is actually a trans guy on the West Coast. I'm forgetting the seminary or the school he's at. He's written some really cool stuff on trans Christian theology. There's tons of feminist theology and queer theology. That's really important to do that work. But at the end of the day, it's you and whatever God you believe in, right? And recognizing that there's a whole bunch of dudes that wrote this stuff, so I'm just saying, right? Not that, I mean, dudes are great, but there's feminist interpretations of this stuff. So. But yeah, talk to Anna Mercedes if anybody has questions about that, because that's her jam, and she's a great faculty member. And it's been years since I was in seminary, and I quit, so I don't have the answers for y'all. Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess as the director of like some organization, how do I make my program more inclusive or just more intersectional?
So how do you make like IWL in particular more inclusive, more intersectional? Right, y'all. Be safe. Peace. I mean, it sounds like some of what y'all are doing is that, right? Like you've incorporated naming pronouns, like the board that y'all have over there, like your favorite feminists, like that is so cool, right? Like I feel like the folks that you study and the folks that you bring in your life, the folks you follow on Instagram enrich the things you think about and the things you see and the things you hear, that those can make incredible impacts on the work that you do, right? And one of the reasons I love being a scholar of women's and gender studies is that it requires a consistent sort of ethos of self-reflection, right? That there's always gonna be sort of, the student affairs folks I work with call it a learning edge, and I don't actually quite know what that means, but I think I do, right? That there's always the edges of where we can do better, right? That better around our language, right? Around disability has been a huge learning edge for me around my language, right? When we talk about, oh, I was so paralyzed with fear, or I'm blind to this, right? How do we, or like, that's so lame, right? How do we like deploy really ableist language in ways that are really dismissive of folks with disability? And that's a learning edge for me, right? So always being open to being challenged in those ways. But I think about like some of the folks I follow on Instagram, Rachel Cargill, Erica Hart, Alok, right? And I listen to them because they have different identities than I do. They experience different positionalities, different relationships to power, and they challenge me. And I think about stuff I would never think about otherwise. So I think about who I put in my life, who I'm in touch with on a day-to-day basis, right? Even if I don't know them personally. And I feel like that's what y'all are doing. Like, y'all are doing good stuff. Yeah. But that's one of the ways I think of Instagram. Use social media for good, because the rest of it's the worst. Literally the worst.
Who else do you know as
Alok, Erica Hart, Rachel Cargill, also some really cute puppies called Harlow and Sage. I mean, you have to have good stuff too, right? Cute animals. But Erica Hart, Rachel Cargill are two Black feminist thinkers. Alok, they're just radically queer. That it makes a difference, right? I've noticed a shift in what I think about. There's another one for white folks in the room called No White Saviors that's really good. Queer Appalachia is another one that's really linked up with some like indigenous activism. There's, I mean, if you just Google like cool activists, party. Any other questions, y'all? Cool. So it's a little bit after 8, so I would say maybe let's call it, because folks have been sitting. There's cookies at the back. There's lemonade and water. I think that's it.